Hey guys, welcome back. Andrew here with Ambient Endeavors. And you know, we guitar players have a whole host of buzzwords and catchphrases that we like to use when we talk about or describe our gear. One of those is the term pedal platform. And I wanted to make a video and just kind of talk about this concept or this term of pedal platform, talk about what makes an amp a good pedal platform, and maybe even hear from you guys. What are your favorite amps to run your pedal boards into? What makes for you a good pedal platform or an amp that really kind of works and jives well with your effects that you're running into them? And just kind of explore this concept of pedal platforms. If you're new to the channel here, thanks for joining us. Please hit subscribe below so you can keep up to date on all the future videos. Drop any comments or thoughts you have on this topic below in the comments, and I love to engage and chat with you down there. So if you've seen any of the videos recently on the channel in the last few months, I've been leaning pretty hard into this amp behind me here. Supro sent it over. It's their Keeley Custom 12 amp, and this is going to be our sort of reference point and our subject for this topic, because Supro is dubbing this amp and their Keeley Custom 10 a good pedal platform, a really pedal friendly circuit, and an amp that just works really well when you're throwing pedals at it for a number of reasons. So we're going to use that as our test case and kind of our subject here. It's worked really well in a lot of the different scenarios I've used it in, and I think the sounds kind of speak for themselves. So it'll be kind of fun to dissect this topic, talk a little bit about the amp, and then hear some sounds as we go from this Keeley Custom 12 and a small pedal board of pedals. We'll just run down the specs for the Keeley Custom 12 so you kind of have a frame of reference. It's a 1x12 amp, a 25 watt circuit. There's 6v6 power, and it has a 2-band EQ with bass and treble, and then a simple gain control and master volume control. So there's not a ton of controls to kind of clutter the circuit. You have that kind of traditional Supro, slight kind of mid presence and growl there. You do get some grit when you turn up the gain, but you can also get some cleaner tones from it. It also features a really transparent effects loop, and we'll get into that in a second. But that is the Keeley Custom 12 from Supro. But that kind of rounds out a cool, pretty straightforward amp that was designed in collaboration with Keeley Electronics. So right there, you already have this kind of collaborative environment where you have a pedal builder helping to design and form the kind of design decisions with an amp builder, and that synergy really kind of helps to present this amp as a really solid pedal platform like they're claiming. So what makes an amp a good pedal platform? Well, I think we need to talk about three different things. The first thing that comes to mind for me when we talk about pedal platform amps is this idea of headroom. So headroom essentially is this concept that gets at how much clean space do you have in an amp before it starts to break up. There are some general concepts with amps that you kind of encounter in terms of headroom Generally, lower wattage amps will have less headroom just due to the design and the simplicity of some of those lower wattage circuits. There's just not as much possibility for there to be that kind of gap between moderate volume clean tone and the point at which the amp starts to break up or saturate the tubes. As you get into the higher wattage categories of amps, you start to see more amps that have higher headroom. I think of sort of the gold standard of this as like the Fender Twin, which is 85 watts, and you just have a ton of clean headroom in those amps. You can turn them up till they're blisteringly loud and still get some pretty sparkly cleans there. So headroom comes into play when you talk about a pedal platform amp, because in my mind, in my experience, I tend to want an amp that stays fairly clean, that does have some space between the moderate volume clean levels and when it starts to saturate the tubes there, to be able to kind of insert those effects, whether it be overdrive, fuzz, distortion, or the wet effects to modulation and delay and reverb, so that there's enough space before the amp kind of starts to saturate and color and kind of dirty itself. In my experience, some of those older Fender amps in the higher wattage range, like I mentioned, the Twin, I also am really a big fan of the Bandmaster head. They offer some pretty robust clean sounds and a pretty big range of headroom there that allows you to throw your dirt and your wet effects at it without totally sending the amp into power amp breakup. The second concept that I think of when I think about a pedal platform amp and something I would look for if I'm wanting to really throw a bunch of effects at an amp is frequency response and kind of just the overall voicing of the amp. Certain amps you plug into and play really have their own kind of voice, their own tone, their own characteristic that can come through in certain pronounced or prominent frequency ranges. If I think of like a Vox amp, you get some very present upper mids. You don't get a lot of low end or bass response on certain Vox circuits. And then there's other amps that are voiced darker or kind of fuller in the low or low mids and have a rounder top end. And when you plug into those amps, even without any pedals, you can really tell that there's a voice and there's kind of an overall frequency response there that gives the amp its character. When I think about pedal platforms, I kind of want an amp that's a little bit more boring, for lack of a better term, an amp that doesn't have a very pronounced frequency bump. So that's why I think certain people have the experience where they're plug into like an AC15 and have a really hard time throwing overdrive or different effects at it and getting a good result, because there's already a lot going on with certain voicing and frequency responses in that type of amp, that to throw pedals at it can kind of yield results that are less than desirable. So with an amp like the Supro behind me here, you do have a fairly balanced frequency response across bass, middle, and treble. The whole kind of spectrum of frequencies there allow for the insertion of overdrive and those wet effects, like I mentioned, without totally kind of congesting or manipulating the voicing and the sound of the amp too much. If you think about frequencies, if you've got a very pronounced kind of frequency bump in an amp and you throw an overdrive or a distortion pedal at it, it's just going to kind of like magnify or amplify those frequencies, often in a way that just feels like too much. It can feel congested. It can feel just like oddly bold or too pronounced in that way. And so that kind of more balanced flat frequency response across the whole spectrum is really what allows for the amp to kind of take whatever pedals you're throwing at it and let you kind of dial in some of your sounds and your frequency bumps or things like that with your pedals. There are also certain types of features that amps have that can allow for the amp to be more conducive to receiving certain types of pedals for different situations or for different players' preferences. Like I mentioned earlier, the Supro has an effects loop, which essentially allows you to place usually your wet effects, your reverbs and delays after the preamp section, before the power amp section of the amplifier. And so it allows you to insert those effects at a place where it's not going to affect as much of that headroom and that preamp saturation. If you send effects into the front end of your amp, it's going to be interacting with those preamp tubes in a way that can cause saturation, can cause it to break up earlier than you'd like. By having the effects loop, you have a little bit different experience and a different kind of sonic quality to some of those effects because of where they're being placed. And so that's something that certain players will prefer or will look for in a more pedal-friendly pedal platform amp. Just from my experience, I tend to kind of pattern my rig and plan my rig with the assumption that all my effects are going to go into the front end of the amp. But we're going to take a look at what it sounds like to throw some reverb and delay into the effects loop of this Keeley Custom 12 from Supro here, and just kind of get a sense of how that sounds and feels. Hopefully this kind of helps frame, at least from my perspective, what this concept or idea of a pedal platform amp is. It's by no means the start and end of the conversation, and like I try and remind folks, there's no real hard and fast rule with this kind of stuff. Like I mentioned, I like to run my effects right into the front of my amp. There's nothing that says that's right or wrong versus running effects in your effects loop. There's also nothing that says you can't run a bunch of pedals into an AC-15 and have good results or like the sounds that you're getting. And so it's just sort of a way to help define and kind of clarify that term, and hopefully in talking about sort of the interaction of pedals and the amp that you choose, and kind of help you as you navigate setting up your rig, as you evaluate the tones that you're getting with the gear that you're getting, and all that. So drop any questions you've got. If you're curious about any of these three things we talked about, if you've got some revelations or kind of are scratching your head about something with your rig, drop a comment below and we can chat about that and help you get to the bottom of it. Thanks as always for watching. Thanks again to Supro for sending over the Keeley Custom 12 here for the video, and we'll see you next time.